Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Justin Norman. I am the host of a podcast called The Flip. We interview entrepreneurs from around the continent to explore contextually relevant insights and stories from around the continent. So thank you to AfricArena for having me moderate this panel today. And we've got three esteemed guests who are ready to speak about open innovation, and in particular, the relationship between corporates and the innovators, the startups and the scale-ups on the continent. So rather than having me introduce them, I think I'll let us go around the room, and maybe if we go in ABC order, it's also ladies first. So Catherine, do you want to introduce yourself first? And can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thank you, Justin. So I'm Catherine Young. I'm the founder of ThinkRoom. We work across Africa on entrepreneurship development. And then I'm the co-owner of the Grindstone Accelerator and the Grindstone Fund out of South Africa. And just watch the Africa space. That's also coming soon. But that's what we do. I was first on the corporate side for many, many years and just got involved with entrepreneurship quite early in my corporate career and fell in love, and then took that big step. You know, everybody takes that big step of getting out of corporate and then into the world of entrepreneurship. And I've been here for the last 8 or 9 years and just loving it, working still with corporates because they do what they do well, and then working with entrepreneurs and trying to blend the two. So that's me.
You're on the good side, so welcome. Ganesh, I think you're up next.
Hi, I'm Ganesh. I'm a lead private sector specialist for the World Bank based in Pretoria. I moved to Pretoria from Washington in February, and I've been enjoying lockdown in Pretoria since then. I come from the global practice of the World Bank covering finance, competitiveness, and innovation. And entrepreneurship is a big part of what we support in our client countries. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. And Michael?
Cool, thanks for having me. So my name is Mike Grant. I'm the CTO of Data Profit. And Data Profit is a machine learning company where we decided to take AI into the world of manufacturing with the express objectives of making these operations better on this journey towards autonomous manufacturing. In doing so, we've won awards from the World Economic Forum, from Daimler, and from a host of others.
Cool, thank you all. So this panel is entitled, How Do We Use Open Innovation to Reinvent the Future? So I guess before we try to answer that question, my first boss said wisdom begins with the definition of terms. So I like to do that. Let's define open innovation, and maybe the answer, maybe the definition differs amongst the three of you. So I'd like to start right there to ask, what does open innovation mean to you? So we can go in the same order. Catherine, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, sure. So when I was asked to join the panel, my first thought was, when I read the title Open Innovation, my first thought was, oh my goodness, if only we can get this right. So if I can just start with that first. So for me, open innovation really is sharing, the notion of sharing broadly, and I know we'll get into in the panel later talking about this, but just the fact that nothing really is under NDA, is it? And about how do we collaborate in making it bigger, regardless of being worried about competitors finding out or not. And we'll share some examples later of where we've seen it work wonderfully and where we haven't. And as the entrepreneur goes through a life stage, I'm speaking for the entrepreneur side in this question, as we go through this life stage with them, how they go from absolutely sharing nothing, wanting to sign an NDA before they start talking, all the way through to wanting to share and collaborate. So open innovation really for me is just that. It's innovating jointly to whatever the better purpose is.
Ganesh?
Thank you, Catherine. I thought it was a fantastic definition, and I fully subscribe to that. Maybe just to add a little more to that is that, if you look at the most successful entrepreneur ecosystems globally at level of cities and so on, what sort of sets them apart is the quality of interaction amongst the stakeholders in the ecosystem. The dynamics of collaborating and debating and contestability of ideas. I think that dynamism reflects open innovation. It's much more beyond just corporate innovation. It's looking at the whole ecosystem itself.
Cool. And Mike?
So I got an interesting position of view on this problem, and I'm a beneficiary of open innovation because I get to walk into these industrial plants that consist of some of the world's most complicated machinery. And there's an interface that I can connect to and get data out of these machines. And there are well-defined interfaces, and they're there. And we haven't yet found a case where the interface is locked down. And so I can walk into a foundry here on the Western Cape and extract meaningful process data across all of these systems. And I can go across to one of our clients in the States and do exactly the same thing on a completely different platform. And so what open innovation means to me is something that exists already, that folk had the forethought to build into their engineering designs 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but perhaps they just weren't calling it the same thing. But it is this general principle that we make information available, we use this information to make decisions. And I think one of the tenets that they built into this was some consideration of trust, that if you're going to be able to connect to the machine, the owners of the machine trust you enough to look at the data and to do it. So there's a physical realization of what open innovation is.
Yeah, I'd like to actually ask you a follow-up question that can allow us to segue into sort of the relationship between, incumbents and corporates and those who have a lot of customers, and then those who are sort of the fast-moving innovators. You mentioned, readily being able to plug into data sources, for example, of some of the corporates that you work with. And, maybe Ganesh, I'll ask you afterwards about, open banking and finance and so on. But what has your experience, Mike, been in terms of working in the manufacturing sector? Like, are they taking an open approach? Do they really welcome you in with open arms? I mean, what are the conversations like with corporates to say, like, trust us, this is a rising tide lifts all boats type of opportunity? Or does it vary, I suppose, business by business, as it may in other sectors?
Absolutely. Right. So I think folk are rightfully concerned about the protection of their data. So the one thing that we get asked or tested quite heavily on is, what are the basic hygiene principles that we employ when we interface with or move some of the client's data? And we've been audited to a variety of international standards and third-party requirements. And once folk have been satisfied with that, then we find that the doors open widely. And I think that this is maybe building on that previous comment around trust. So you've got this validation that what you say is correct, and that's what these audits seek to establish. And then once you've established that level of competence, the trust opens right up. And then the conversation shifts towards the value proposition. Okay, so you're going to innovate using my information, my systems, my platforms, my data. But what are we going to get out of this collaboration? What do we get? What is the problem that you're going to try and solve? And then you've got to make this conversation more about business value. So you engage with us and, we halve your scrap rates by 40%. We reduce the waste that you produce substantially, or the energy consumption significantly.
Yeah.
And then the whole conversation shifts now. Oh, wait, that's interesting to me. Yeah.
And hopefully the value propositions that you can offer, I mean, it becomes very self-evident and an easy decision once you can get in the door. Yeah, hopefully. Ganesh, I'd like to speak specifically about open banking, because I think that when we talk about open innovation, at least in my mind, that is sort of from a tech perspective, really what is the most prevalent. And, open banking as a sort of buzz term unto itself, but on the continent in particular, I think from East Africa to West Africa to Southern Africa, whether it's M-Pesa and Vodacom and Safaricom taking an open approach, opening up their APIs, or in West Africa, there's a number of, API marketplaces that are building the connections between banks and other financial institutions. I mean, what does that mean for you in terms of the infrastructure that's being built to enable open innovation? And maybe we can also ask, what is the World Bank's role in either facilitating or contributing to building that which needs to be built to create an even more enabling environment?
Oh, fantastic, Justin. Thank you. So let me sort of think about it in the following ways. So firstly, digital financial services are going to be critical. in terms of increasing financial inclusion in Africa. And as we all know, it's a huge challenge in many parts of Africa. Despite having fairly decent mobile penetration and so on, the percentage of people who have access to a simple bank account or to very simple financial services is still very, very low. So I think there are sort of four sort of elements to this. The first, of course, is, as you said, Justin, is the infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, the telco infrastructure that has to be put in place. And this is really a private sector driven activity. So it's about government making it easier for private investments and facilitating private investments in infrastructure, especially in last mile infrastructure, where you require government subsidies and some de-risking of investments for private investors. So first, it's infrastructure investments. Secondly, it's the policy and regulatory environment that allows the entry of innovative service providers, tech solutions, including startups, to open up the space, because in many of the countries in Africa, the industry is still very much controlled by state-owned enterprises. There's a huge role for government. So it's to deregulate and open up the space for private investment, but with very clear social objectives as well, so that it doesn't become a profitable business for these companies that focus only on the lucrative markets in the big cities, but neglect the population in the rural areas where most of the people live. So that's that element of policy and regulatory improvements. Thirdly, it's about digital literacy and skills, digital skills, because a lot of emphasis is about making people understand the value of digital financial services and how it can impact their lives. So there's a whole element of literacy and education and awareness, which is critical to promote digital financial services. And perhaps the fourth one, which is sort of underlying, is the governance around all this, to make sure that the institutions are in place that protect consumers, that regulate markets more effectively, and spectrum allocation, for example, for telcos, that's a huge area. So to kind of fit all these pieces together, and these are areas where the World Bank is engaged with our counterparts.
Mm-hmm. And Catherine, I'd love to ask you, as someone who is sort of closer to the ground, dealing with the relationship between corporates and startups, the innovators, and then also, you mentioned Grindstone before. I mean, your business partner is very very adamant about there being a Startup Act, for example, from a regulatory perspective in South Africa. So can you speak a little bit to that, and maybe building on some of what Ganesh just talked about, the things that you're experiencing in the work that you're doing on sort of these three sort of prongs of opportunity sets?
Sure. I'll start with the second one first. I think that's probably the easiest one to start with, the digital literacy and skills bit that you've mentioned, Ganesh. So it made me think of a program that we ran through about 2 years ago in Cameroon, where we had to engage with about 200 startups, really at startup level, and maybe some of them in growth phase, just to try and get these startups digitally literate and improve skills. And interestingly enough, the execution wasn't only about getting them digitally literate, but Ganesh, exactly as you said, the connectivity, the devices, it's holistic. It's one thing driving the digital literacy theoretically, but on the ground, it works quite differently. And we were able to get these startups empowered with not only the skill, but also the devices. And the actual growth in business that we saw on the ground happen was quite phenomenal. I'm thinking of another one, Cote d'Ivoire, where we're just about to launch a program with 100 female entrepreneurs. And I want to now touch on the first point that you raised there, Ganesh, to link that in, where literally we saw the government coming in and wanting to work with the female entrepreneurs, with us on the ground, as well as some of the private sector companies coming in and working that. So, but there were some regulatory things that needed to change for us to be enabled to just get that program executed. And then on the, let me go to the Startup Act, definitely, absolutely, and yes, Justin, was actually on a conference call just yesterday where we were speaking about some of the countries in Africa that have got the Startup Act down to a T and those have not. And it is just real in terms of creating that enabling environment to get the country to move. And one of the panelists on this call yesterday said, and I couldn't agree more, it's just like, you know, we're trying to create this one trade zone in Africa. We're trying to open borders. We're trying to make it easier for startups and scale-ups to just do business throughout Africa. The reality is it's good in principle, but until we don't get countries to act on it, no pun intended, it's going to just be so difficult to have the environment to do so. So, and really the bottom line is some countries are further behind than others, and it's imperative for us to get going on it, because it will just create that environment and make things easier. Imagine we can get a Startup Act through just 50% of the countries on the continent, what that can do for business. And we've seen it work, and we've seen it hasn't. And I don't think we should stop asking. And again, as we spoke earlier on a different conversation, it's up to us as an ecosystem. It's not only up to governments. It's up to us all to continue rooting for it to make it work. So I'm very, very passionate about all 3 points that you've raised, actually, Ganesh.
Mm-hmm. And what about corporates? I'd like to also talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously, many markets across Africa are very corporately dominated, and you left corporate to work with startups, and they obviously play a huge role from a private sector perspective. Not only that, I mean, banks and telcos, for example, have all the data, they have all the customers, and so on and so forth. And so what, in terms of innovation and in terms of disruption and all of these sort of buzzwords that we talk about, I mean, like, what's your experience been with their reception to working with startups and those who will ultimately disrupt them? And who in particular, I mean, do you have any examples of anyone in particular that's taken a particularly positive and impactful approach towards doing that?
Sure. So either way I answer this question, it's going to be hot water, right? So let me just jump right into the hot water. It's there are those who will and those who just won't. And for corporates, they all turn, I'm generalizing, but many of them turn slowly. It's a slow tanker. They move slower. They're not as agile. And I suppose completely understandable from my time in corporate. It just is completely understandable. It's completely different criteria set. It's a completely different work style, work life. But the reality is the agility is not there. And what we are finding is that some of the corporates who truly see startups and scale-ups as a way of getting them to innovate quicker, to innovate in a different way, and not to have to do everything in-house and run through 10 approval levels instead of maybe 2 or 3 when you bring the innovation in, rather from starting from scratch. And truly, some of them will, and some of them do embrace, and some of them just never will. And we always say to the startups and the scale-ups we work with, truthfully, before you go and sell anything to any corporate, whether innovative or not, it's not up to you to think as a startup how innovative it is. It really is up to you to convince the corporate buyer on the other side that they will get their next bonus, reach the next KPI, and get the next box ticked. And I think if we can accept that as a fact, it would be so much easier to just get innovation into the corporates, because really the drivers are different. The drivers are not necessarily about innovation. It's about the 13th and the 14th check. So the other piece of advice to startups always is, I say, go and look at corporates that are embracing innovation in this way. I mean, if we see, some of those mergers and acquisitions, we haven't touched on that, but some of the mergers and acquisitions, if you just the likes of Microsoft, the likes of Apple, I just read the stat the other day. I can't remember the detail exactly, but an amazing amount of M&As just where innovation is bought in. So go find the corporates where it's easier to sell that in and then go with it rather than trying to knock on the door forever and not getting through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you that there's definitely like a self-selection element to all of this. But I would like to maybe get some more, personal perspective. Mike, I mean, you're the representative from, the startup or the scale up realm. And I actually think it's kind of funny that out of everyone on this panel here, you're the only one wearing a collared shirt. Whereas, so I don't know if that's by design because you have to deal with a lot of corporates or what it is, but I don't know. I've very much embraced my, the startup ethos and try to represent myself accordingly. But, you mentioned before, the process to some extent that you have to go through to compel the corporates that you work with why your services are useful for them. What and I guess this is business in general, right? Like you have to make a compelling proposition, but whether it's regulatory issues in the Startup Act or whether it's corporates maybe being more explicit about what their strategies are around innovation. I mean, are there things that you wished happened from where you sit and the work that you do that would be like, man, if we could just, improve the communication or meet halfway a little bit better? It's not to say that corporates aren't moving halfway, but what has your experience been like? And, are there things from your experience that you wish happened more to make this open innovation thing easier than it might be at present?
Good question. And I think that this is maybe a bit of a commentary on how some corporates design themselves. Because when you look at big companies, they're invariably successful, big, because they found a great value proposition and have exploited it very well, right? And they've grown and they've acquired a whole bunch of folk to do this bigger and scale out. And so when you bring an idea to a corporate, you've got to really speak to the right folk. So if I'm chatting with and you get these wonderful people who run these innovation teams within very large companies, and their whole brief is bring me the new, bring me the exciting. You're writing the business plan for the future business, right? So whatever you're working on will have some relevance in the +5 year horizon, and that is very loosely defined in terms of value. Right? So here you're going to go and do some POC kind of development. And when you do a POC, you really just need to convince somebody that the idea is good enough to try out. But if you want to mature that through into something that a buyer would then think about, you've got to have a much more mature product and offering and conversation. And you've got to get, well, it's maybe not innovation driven. It's the result of innovation done elsewhere. And now you get to benefit from this product that then moves your business forward. And this is if I had any wish for hindsight 5 years ago, it would have been to know just that little bit of the way that the world is organized. And it's not always self-evident. And so you've got to make this very compelling value statement to the right folk in the business. So for us, it's been a lot about honing that messaging, honing the conversation, finding out the right folk to chat to have the sort of conversion conversation with. Yeah. It's more than enough folk out there willing to investigate innovation, but then you just get an innovation result. You don't necessarily drive big change through the business.
Mm-hmm. Are just as a follow-up, are the right people to talk to readily found?
It's a challenge. It's hide and seek.
But is that fair, right? Like, I mean, you're spending all your time building products. Is it part of your job description to also, have to roam the halls of a big corporate to find the right people to talk to? Or if they actually care about innovation, should they make them the right people more easily found?
I think to use an analogy, right? I can have a great idea. if I fail to communicate it, I might as well not have had the great idea. And so the burden is on me to communicate what we do properly to the correct folk. I don't think you can go and say, oh, it's my customer's fault.
Mm.
And my customer could be, and in this case is a corporate. And so I'm more than willing to accept that responsibility and that challenge and rise to it and do better in that. It wouldn't be fair to go and transfer that responsibility through to a corporate who's never met you before, who are meant to be out there and finding you. I think that wouldn't, it doesn't feel like the correct balance of power.
Yeah. I suspect what makes entrepreneurs good entrepreneurs in the first place is that they sort of figure it out no matter what anyway. So, yeah, it's a good point. So Ganesh, I mean, maybe to shift gears a little bit, like if I have this expectation that it's hard to navigate corporates, I suspect it's probably even harder to navigate the governments. And so given where you sit and that you're a private sector specialist, and the sort of intersection between then the relationship and the share of responsibilities for, developing the continent between governments and between the private sector. I mean, what is that dynamic like? Is it similar to that which we've discussed in terms of corporate startup, or is it a whole other thing altogether?
I was fascinated by the experience of Michael and Catherine from the perspective of a startup and from sort of the corporate perspective. So just let me sort of maybe pick up on what they both said before I get to your question, Justin. I think if you look at the sort of more enlightened corporates who see the value of engaging with startups, I mean, they're doing it very seriously. I mean, the startups are now developing in-house VC capabilities because they see the value of agile startups that are basically eating their lunch, right? And they want to make sure that they're able to get these guys into their embrace before they go off and do something that's going to destroy their business. So I think what they are doing is to kind of engage with startups in a formal way, but leveraging the value of intermediaries who reduce the friction, the kind of friction that Michael described. The kind of heavy lifting that the startups themselves have to do. How do you minimize that? By using the services of third-party accelerators and service providers who kind of then, go out there, look for the startups, validate them, screen them, test them, and then, on the other side, they work with the corporates, get the user needs, figure out exactly what they want, and kind of do the matchmaking, right? In fact, right now, I'm in the middle of those conversations, trying to pilot something with corporates and startups in South Africa. So I think that is probably an approach which if it works, which could scale in terms of creating the trust and the confidence between startups and corporates. And there's also a sector element to this. If you look at some sectors like insurtech and fintech, these things are moving a lot faster than in sort of the more traditional sectors, right? So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from those experiences. Now, going back to your question of government and corporates, again, like Catherine, I don't want to get into hot water by getting too much into this debate, but let's look at the positive side of it, public procurement, right? If you look at public procurement instruments that government already has, this can be leveraged to reach out there, get innovative solutions, support small businesses, and bring in innovation into government systems and processes. Now, for that to happen, you need the political willingness and the kind of commitment to do this, which goes back to the points which I mentioned earlier about governance and institutions. So are governments becoming more open? Yes, for sure. I think some governments are seeing the value of this and are engaging more and more with the innovation ecosystem. Others less so. I think it's a process of awareness and engagement and learning from each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One thing that I was thinking about as everyone was talking is just timing as well. And maybe we can talk about this in the context of something like a company's journey, right? Just to go back to, startups and scale-ups. And Catherine, you mentioned M&A a little bit earlier, and, we're having this conversation in light of, for example, a pretty big acquisition on the continent this year with Paystack being acquired by Stripe. And, even a couple of months earlier in South Africa, the DPO group was acquired as well, which is the parent company to PayFast. So payments, I guess, are hot this year. But Catherine, I'll turn it over to you first in terms of M&A. And, so often the conversation amongst the startup ecosystem is like, it's just a matter of time, right? Like, it's still a very nascent industry, and for corporates and even individuals alike to see the value in what's happening here is it maybe there just needs to be more exits. They need to see that taking these sorts of career paths can be viable, and that they can have outsized impacts on corporates. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts just on that, and on timing, and how much of this is just us needing to be patient and letting these companies build, and over time, the things will compound, and the change will happen.
I love the question. I really do. It's been so much in our world. We're busy with Grindstone cohort 6 and 7, so we're really living it at the moment. I'll take an actual example. So I first want to speak about timing the life stage of the startup, and then the timing of the M&A. So we one particular company in our cohort currently really know they will shoot the lights out. They're just not ready. They're not there, and they're not going to be the ready. Unfortunately, in my opinion, 3 years. In their mind, they're saying 18, and I hope truly it is. So what we're trying to do, and with this company as well, we try and just be very real from the beginning about where you are at in your life stage. And then we actually, and we've done this with this particular company now, where we've actually already arranged and had 2 potential exits eventually in our minds, discussions with corporates, with this organization. They're not ready. They're far from being ready. But for me, it's much more important for the startup to be in the corporate's mind right from the start. And Ganesh, I loved your point so much. It is the role of the ecosystem players to do that, to just play that middleman, and to say, we have something, it's not ready, but we know it will suit your business, Mr. Corporate, Mrs. Corporate, in future. Just work with us. The value that we got out of the 2 corporate meetings that we had, to come back to the startup and say, this is the list of things we need you to go work on. And if you can do this, we really are interested. So of course, from an ecosystem point of view, I won't do that with every corporate in my world in the same way. Of course, we know them differently, but there needs to be deep trust between ecosystem players and the corporates, of course, because you can only take the wrong startup once, and then the trust is broken. And then literally, we worked this plan with this particular organization, where I know that roadmap is 3 years, and I'm so happy to be wrong on it. And we will work those. So we've built that into their roadmap for the next 18 to 36 months. We've worked that into how we will build that data room. We are preparing for it now. And the mindset of the startup has changed. I can see it. Now in the approach, it's a thing of, oh my goodness, have I got the vision in mind? Will the M&A happen? Will the acquisition happen? Who knows? But I know if it doesn't happen to the 2 corporates we've spoken to, we set up for that success anyway with corporate number 3 or corporate number 4 that will come on. And I think it's about getting the corporate involved in the journey early. And then the last thing I want to say, sorry, I'm speaking too much on this, but I'm so passionate about this. The last thing I want to say is to have ins into the corporate at least 3 levels in. So people in corporates move. They may be there today in a position, then they move on. You've just done all that work, and then you've got to start the work again. So it's really about how deep can you build your levels into the corporate, and if they're not ready to buy right now, that's okay, but keep on keeping on at that relationship until they get there. So those are some of my inputs.
Yeah, and I think all the while, these companies, while they may be building and setting themselves up for a prospective exit to a corporate, are building good businesses, right? And I think that's obviously the most important part as well. So Mike, from a data profit perspective, I'm looking at your guys' stats right now. You're 6 years old. You raised a Series A. And if I'm not mistaken, you've got some corporates, whether they're customers or strategic partners, on your cap table as well as investors. So how do you think of the journey from a timing perspective? I don't know if you guys explicitly think about like prospective exits yet, or if you think about the timeline of an exit, if you're not talking about, who might be your acquirers yet. But I'm curious to hear how you guys think about it.
We think about the world from an aspirational perspective. We have come into these manufacturing operations and we've literally transformed them. We've reduced for example, the production of scrap at a rate basis by 40%. And if you convert that through to something really important, like tons of carbon dioxide that haven't been released because they've burnt less energy, we've made the world better. And I can keep making the world better. And I'm not about to stop. Mm-hmm. And I think that can answer your exit question.
So Data Profit's going to IPO.
I'm going to keep making the world better.
I don't mean to. I don't mean
exactly.
to hold your feet to the fire, or break news or anything. I said that facetiously, but
I think that right now we've got this immense opportunity where we can transform the world. We have some cases in many different industries where we have this kind of impact.
Yeah.
And aspiration, what we can bring to bear in this world, can't stop now.
Yeah, and that's an important thing, I think, as well, especially when we look at from an early stage perspective, is like what kind of businesses are these entrepreneurs trying to build, and are they going to be 100-year companies, or is it something that you can flip on secondaries, and obviously it depends on the entrepreneurs, it depends on the business, but certainly there's a number of big enough problems worth solving that if you can solve them right, and if you can capture the value, you'll be around for a long time, in spite of who is going to acquire you, that sort of question that may not actually be relevant.
And it's quite meta, right? Because what I get out of this is I've made a contribution to the world. I've made a contribution to data science. Some of the math we've discovered in our journey. We watch the world quite closely to see if anyone's getting close to the way that we're thinking. But these are proper contributions, and it's just a privilege to be part of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree.
Kind of drive, right?
Yeah. Ganesh, from a World Bank perspective, and if we go just back, a little bit back to ecosystem development, and in line with this question that we're having, I mean, I also think a lot about like this idea about public goods, right? And there's so much to build on the continent, and to what extent do market forces dictate what ought to exist, or what problems are worth solving? And then obviously this is the role, I suspect, where DFIs and where entities like the World Bank and the IFC and other foundations then play a role in helping to build the future that we wish to see and fill gaps, market gaps in particular. So I'd love for you to speak about that in the context of this conversation that we're having now, and the types of things that the World Bank does to help things that should exist for longer.
That sounds like a topic for another panel discussion, Justin. But just let me start by saying that I'm so inspired by my fellow panelists, what Michael and Catherine have shared. I think it's really inspiring and very exciting. So let's talk about COVID, because COVID is changing everything that that we used to take for granted, and we thought we cannot figure it out. So if we look at what's happening now in not just in Africa, but globally, so businesses are reinventing themselves. The digital transformation agenda is accelerating. Corporates are looking at their supply chains and digitizing supply chains and so on and so on. So there are a lot of opportunities coming out from the digital transformation that is being driven by the realities of COVID. So I think that's the opportunity for Africa. So again, going back to the earlier points I made about skills and education, infrastructure, and getting businesses ready to benefit from the digital dividends coming out of the pandemic. So that's one. Two is you said about the greater good. It's about the inclusiveness agenda, reducing inequality and enhancing inclusiveness. So there are many parts of the ecosystem now that are currently underserved. Women, for example, and people in rural areas, and so on and so forth. So how do we bring them into the ecosystem through targeted initiatives and to kind of to support these segments of the population, improving access to infrastructure, education, skills, and business opportunities. So that's the second agenda. So let me just stop at these two for now, and then we can have another conversation. Thank you.
No, that's maybe a separate panel altogether. So I apologize for that. But so in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to ask a question to each of you, just as a way to sort of look towards the future and to wrap up this panel. But obviously 2020, you just mentioned COVID. 2020 has been a pretty weird year. Hopefully things start to feel a little bit more normal 2021. But in spite of that, I certainly remain very bullish about all the work that people are doing on the continent and what everyone is building. And so I'd love to hear from each of you just about what's exciting you, whether it's trends that are happening on the continent, whether it's work that you're working on, whether it's something that somebody else is doing that is exciting to you. And frankly, maybe it doesn't even have to do with the continent altogether, but could be from a global perspective. So what is something that you're excited about and that's exciting you? And then we can leave it there. Catherine, do you want to start first?
Absolutely. So I just absolutely love how this year has leveled the playing fields, truly, from how we travel, from how we engage, from how we do business. Everybody, for the first time in our world history, I think we have a level playing field. And if that isn't exciting, and we see that with the startups who see this, and business partners, that's why I love who I work with. For us, the opportunities that come about, and of course it's hard work, and of course we cry many times, and of course we only hit 3 out of every 10, but it's about that keeping on, because we have now no excuse. We're not at the most southern tip of Africa. Geographically, we are now right next to Washington, D.C. or Atlanta or Sri Lanka. It really doesn't matter. That's very exciting for me. And then secondly, truthfully, we have taken, I don't know, we all know on the call, how many years has it taken to just get health digital. And for the first time, we're getting that right in such a different way. And there's really major life impacts that could be as a result. So that just excites the heck out of me.
Definitely. Thank you. Ganesh, we'll go in ABC order again. So Ganesh, you're up.
So what's exciting for me is connecting talent to opportunities. I think talent is everywhere, and it's our job to kind of make sure that we find this talent and connect them to resources, support, coaching, mentoring, and money may not be the most important thing. It's really to be recognized and then to be sort of brought into the fold, into the ecosystem.
I like that. Excites me as well. Good answer. And Mike?
So Justin, just to close the loop on my sort of opening comment, where I was the beneficiary of open innovation, which was fundamentally coming from design decisions that engineers made 5-10 years ago. And I think that what excites me the most is what we get to benefit from the design decisions we make today.
Yeah.
And those opportunities are just huge. And we get to realize some of them in the short term, and then we get to see the fruits of our labors bloom into the future. And it's going to be so wild.
Yeah. That things compound is pretty crazy. And, you know, you get to thank your past self for, you know, the people who came before you, that they did the things that they did. It's wholeheartedly agree with that. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Catherine, Ganesh, and Michael, thank you so much to the three of you. And thank you to AfricArena for having us, and to the attendees for listening to us for these 45 minutes or so. And thanks again.